Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please hit that subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate a small amount given the link in the description box. Let me welcome our guest tonight, Joti Brar. Joti is a leader of the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist, an author and a leading critique of Western imperialism. Joti, welcome back to India and Global Left.
Thank you so much, Jotishman.
I wanted to start with the current conflict. So, if I could hear your sense of the conflict between Iran and Israel and United States.
So, I think the first and most important thing to say about that war is it was an illegal, unjust aggression. And according to international law, that is the highest crime against humanity. Now, this fact is glossed over and ignored entirely by most Western reportage, certainly by most Western politicians. But in fact, this has been internationally accepted international law ever since the end of World War II, since the Nuremberg tribunals, in fact. So that's the first thing we have to say. Even from an international law point of view, the aggression is entirely illegal and unjust, and it's the highest crime against humanity to launch an illegal, aggressive war. To launch aggressive war contains within it all the other crimes against humanity, right, that we see, like, attacks on civilians, attacks on the press, attacks on civilian infrastructure, attacks on healthcare workers, attacks on hospitals and schools. All these are crimes against humanity, but they're contained within the biggest crime against humanity, which is the launching of an aggressive war. So that's, I think, the first point to really, make sure we understand when we're talking geopolitics. Sometimes people get so caught up in the details of who's trying to achieve what, they forget to ask themselves about the means by which they're trying to achieve them. Now, from a socialist perspective, from a progressive perspective, we are not pacifists. We don't say, oh, all violence is bad. Of course, as human beings, we feel that all violence is terrible. But we know that imperialism is systemized violence, right? So we can't be pacifists in the face of the violence of the system. There are certain types of wars that progressive people, socialists, communists will support. Wars of the proletariat for its liberation from the bourgeoisie, revolutionary wars, we support those. Wars for the liberation of colonies against colonizers, against imperialism, we support those. Wars of self-defense when attacked by an imperialist predatory power, as we are seeing with Iran. Now, Iran is fighting, in fact, a kind of double war at this point. It has been incredibly patient against multi-pronged and hybrid warfare by the imperialists and their local Zionist and Gulf proxies for the entirety of existence, in fact. But it has known, really, since the time of the revolution, and certainly since the time of the Iran-Iraq war, which was in essence a proxy war waged against Iran by the West, it has known that it's not going to be left alone. And it has been preparing, and it's given signals constantly. Look, we don't want war. We don't want to be attacked. We just want to be left alone, to be sovereign. The problem is the imperialists can't accept a sovereign Iran in the middle of the Middle East, right? So they won't allow Iran to develop peacefully in a sovereign way. Iran has therefore been preparing. And now that this war has finally come about, Iran was signaling for a long time leading up to the outbreak of this war, if you do this, all these things are going to happen to you. And by the way, all of your infrastructure, which includes not just all the infrastructure of the Zionist settler colony, but all the infrastructure of military and intelligence bases and apparatus throughout the Middle East, will also be a target. And also, by the way, we will stop your export of oil from our region, which obviously impacts hugely the Western economic calculus. So this was clearly signaled beforehand. Now we see that Iran is waging this very just defensive war to defend itself, but it's also in a way waging a liberation war for the entire region. It's come to be, just as the Zionist colony is like my comrade calls it, the tip of the spear of the imperialists in the Middle East, well, Iran has become the tip of the spear of the resistance forces in the Middle East, of whom there are many, and they are disparate. And some of them are socialists, some of them are religious, some of them are Sunni, some of them are Shia if they are religious, some of them are secular, of different types. There are many many resistance forces in the Middle East, but Iran has come to be seen as the kind of guiding force of the whole movement, the most staunch supporter of all the various resistance movements, especially since the fall, of course, of Syria a little while back. So Iran now is backed up and supported by resistance movements across the region. They're not its proxies. They are allies, of course, because they're fighting in the same direction, but they are fighting in the same direction. And that's very, very clear. And what they are fighting for, actually, is for the liberation of the whole region from the domination of US imperialism. And I think that's a process, actually, a process that was got underway by the launch of the Palestinian resistance movement on 7th of October, the Al-Aqsa Flood operation, was the beginning of this movement to finally expel the Zionists and the imperialist occupiers from the Middle East. But I think we're now seeing that shifting up to a whole new gear.
Yes. Given you have centered this conversation around empire and imperialism, I wanted you to tell a little bit more about media narratives, because we've seen all kinds of propaganda. I mean, you can't believe it, but Donald Trump himself said that we are going to punish Iran for starting this war. So that's the Western media narrative or mainstream narrative, that Iran has started this war, or it was at the brink of starting a war. In fact, Pat Hicks had said that Israel was going to attack Iran, so Iran would have attacked us, so we attacked them, effectively justifying. These are the same class of people who either failed or denied the significance of special military operation in Ukraine. They were crying about Russia starting this war, blurring or silencing NATO aggression on the borders of Russia. So if you could tell a little bit more about your sense of these two narratives and how they have been flipped on their heads.
Flipped on their heads is an understatement, isn't it? You know, when you want to talk about who started the war, really you've got to go all the way back to World War I. Who reoccupied the Middle East after the Ottoman Empire was defeated? Of course, it was British and French imperialism. Britain is the primary architect of the current geography of the Middle East, but it's an entirely fake and false geography. Just before we get into this question of narratives, I just want to bring a statistic to you that I think is really important. We all know there's a lot of oil in the Middle East, and we all know oil is important to imperialism. But sometimes when we see a list of top 10 oil producers or countries with the top 10 oil reserves, it doesn't actually give us a picture of the full significance of the Middle East, because the Middle East has been carved into pieces. And the oil has been separated from the population centers and divided into little bits in order that the British and now the British and Americans could manage that wealth and make sure it kept coming to them, right? Well, if we actually merge together the territories of the Middle East and North Africa, which the imperialists basically see as one, but have divided into various pieces, and which are inhabited by the Persian, Iranian people and the Arab-speaking nation, Arabic-speaking, the Arab peoples, what we see is, right now, of current world production, that region produces 35% of daily production of oil. It possesses 58% of global proven oil reserves. 58. Everything else pales in significance compared to that. The next one down on the list is a very long way behind, as you can imagine. 58% of the world's proven oil reserves are in North Africa and the Middle East, when you combine the region as one. This is why Israel is so important to the imperialists. It's why they established it in the first place. When the British governor who was put in charge of Mandate Palestine, Ronald Storrs, his name was, talked about establishing Israel all the way back then. It wasn't done as a response to the Holocaust of Jews in Western and Eastern Europe. It was done as part of an ongoing plan to control the oil of the Middle East. And Ronald Storrs described how he envisaged Israel as being as a little loyal Jewish Ulster. So in a sea, and what he said was, in a sea of hostile Arabism, right? So they understood the Arabs want sovereignty and independence. They want to run their own affairs. They want liberation. They want their own development. They want to take care of their own resources and their own lives. We need control of this region. The Arabs are going to be hostile to our control. We need a loyal force in there. So that was the whole purpose of transplanting a settler colonial population. So they used the question of Jewish persecution in Europe to find themselves this loyal population, and they planted it in Palestine. It was very useful to them. But so they are the architects of this whole situation. And if you want to say who started it, they have been starting it incessantly since 1918. Just at this moment in time, the question of who started it, it's sort of farcical and ridiculous, isn't it, to see the statements that come out of the mouths of Donald Trump and his various ministers. But we have to understand the role they play. And the more that imperialism is in decline and decay and actually quite a desperate economic position, the more its leaders represent its decay and decline. And so we have moved from a kind of confident post-World War II US imperialism headed up by very serious, grave-looking statesmen. And yes, they were also fronting for a very hypocritical regime, which was, in essence, violent and exploitative and was carrying out all kinds of bloodletting and coups around the world. But they pretended not to be. And they, in many ways, the face that we now see of the decaying empire is the true face of imperialism. And it's a good lesson to people to understand. This is the real nature. It's like how the recent escalation of the genocide by the Zionists in Palestine, particularly in Gaza, that intensive episode in their ongoing genocide of the Palestinians, showed us the true face of Zionism in a way that many people hadn't understood before, but now it becomes crystal clear. Well, we're also the true face of Zionism, the true face of imperialism. It's the same thing. Zionism is not imperialism's first genocidal settler colonial project, right? And it's not imperialism's first genocidal episode. So the one thing that the imperialists have, to come back to your question, the one thing that the imperialists have an advantage in still is psychological warfare. And the reason being, because not just they've put a lot of research and have a lot of experience in it over more than 100 years, but they also have still a large monopoly over the world's media. In particular, of course, they control most of global social media. And that has a massive impact on their ability to control narratives for people, to control people's mindset, to distract people, to divert them, to confuse them with conflicting and false ideas, and to package up their crimes in little sound bites. And what's interesting, I think, today is, despite this experience, despite this ability, despite this huge machinery of mind control, actually their ability to stick to a story is falling apart in front of our eyes. I mean, literally, we're on which day of the war now? Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, day 6, right? And we've heard probably more than 6 justifications for why the war was started, probably more than 6 explanations of what's the aim of the war, right? Clearly, there's a very chaotic leadership kind of, or there's a chaotic discussion going on behind the front people. I don't really consider that Donald Trump is in charge of US policy or any of the front people for the various ministries, but behind them, the people who made this calculus, which said and repeatedly tells them, I mean, this is one thing, the imperialists are terrible at learning from their own history. One of the reasons being they really don't believe in the ability or the power of the masses. So the people they face, they always consider them to be pawns, dupes, idiots, controllable, manipulable, and their own people too, right? Ordinary people to them are not really quite people at all, and they're not really as clever as they are. The problem is they've created, since the fall of the Soviet Union, they've created almost an echo chamber for themselves in their own intelligence communities. So when they make their calculus, just like when they launched a sanctions blitzkrieg against Russia, and they told themselves this country is just an oil well with a flag, and it's really unpopular government, and it's just going to fall in a few weeks with our sanctions, and they still haven't recovered from that miscalculation, right? They clearly, twice in the last 8 months, they've told themselves that the Iranian regime is now ripe for toppling. And all it needs is a bit of a prod, and a 24-hour operation will see the collapse of Iran, right? They said that to themselves at the time of the 12-day war. The Iranians were actually very patient, because although they gave back to the Israelis and the Americans what was given to them, they didn't go any further, and they stopped it when the Israelis begged for a ceasefire. They got their ceasefire. But the Iranians made it very clear at that time, if you try this again, right, which was what did they try? They tried a decapitation strike, they tried a color revolution, and they tried to disrupt the whole country by bombarding it from the air. And they thought that those things together would result in the collapse of Iran. And they didn't. And the Iranians said, if you try this again, we will no longer be on the defensive, we will go on the offensive, and we will come for all of your structures across the Middle East. They said it. They made it totally clear what they were going to do. And yet 8 months later, the USA comes back with the exact same calculus. All we need to do is, set off a few bombs inside the country, activate some sleeper agents, make some chaos in the streets. The regime is ripe for falling. It's really unpopular. They've got, 3 idiots who left Iran at the time of the Shah, sitting in Washington, no doubt, alongside other various experts, telling them everybody hates the leadership, everybody hates the Ayatollah. How did that work out? Right? Assassinating a man who was essentially seen as the grandfather of the nation, one of the leaders of the revolution, a hero of the people, a wise old guide and teacher of the people, and seen as a leader of resistance forces to imperialism by the whole region, massive backfire. And yet they continue to use the same types of calculus and spin the same types of narrative to their people, despite the fact that they fail time after time after time.
Yeah, one of the things that struck me this time about how bad the messaging was, or how careless they were, was the polls. Reuters and others say that at max, there are about 28% people in the United States who support this war. And that's quite a historic thing, if you like, given Americans have always rallied behind the flag. And during Iraq, during Afghanistan, they used all they could. I mean, the New York Times was marshaled right from 91, but from 98, 99, it was the editorials picked up Brett Stephens and others. I mean, there are many, many more who started writing more and more articles about weapons of mass destruction, etc. And a lot of people believed in it until the resistance started to reveal what the US occupation was. But this time around, it was very different. And that indicates a lot. I mean, Omani Foreign Minister Mohammad al-Busaydi said that we are very, very close to a negotiation, given the Iranian side had conceded even more than what they did under the JCPOA, and the negotiations were going on, and the Vienna round was about to happen, the third round, and they attacked. I mean, it was not a surprise given what they did earlier. But all it led to was that very few people believed in what they were saying.
Absolutely. So on the Iranian side, what's interesting is the imperialists have completely shot themselves in the foot. They actually, through the JCPOA, had been cultivating, if you like, a kind of more compradorable section of the bourgeoisie in Iran that was more interested in good relations with the West, good business, and maybe thought that there was a path to prosperity for them, at least, through just going along with whatever the imperialists want and integrating back with the West. That section now is completely quiet. There is no way back to, there's no section of the population, including young people who, Professor Morandi makes the point, doesn't he, that there's a young section of the population which is bombarded by imperialist media in Farsi, which the imperialists invest heavily in, and who didn't live through any of the crimes of imperialism. They don't remember the Shah. They didn't live through the revolution. They didn't live through the Iran-Iraq war. They're on Western social media, right? So they have their heads stuffed with lies. Some of those people would have, up until recently, believed the lies of the West against their own government, believed that it's Iran causing the problems and the West is the home of everything good. All that work has been destroyed, essentially, by this second in 8 months use of negotiations to cover the timing of your attack. So to take Iran by surprise, by aggressively attacking it and bombing it and killing its leaders, and its military leaders, its scientists, its political leaders, its religious leaders, killing them while you're supposed to be, having a truce, right? While you're supposed to be negotiating a peaceful solution to apparently legitimate concerns. But what's clear is the legitimate concerns are all just excuses. What they're really not prepared to accept, just like they weren't prepared to accept it with Russia, is Iran as a sovereign, independent nation in charge of its own affairs. That's the offense. It's not anything else. And, the whole thing about nuclear weapons is such a hypocrisy. Iran made a point of telling everybody, well, they would make concessions around the nuclear program because they were like, well, we don't really want nuclear weapons. We don't really believe in them. But the truth is, there's a lot of people in Iran now, or have been for a while, and even more now, saying, look, the only thing that stops these people is if you have a flipping nuclear weapon. Look at North Korea, look at Libya, look at Iraq, learn the lessons. They will keep coming for us until they are too scared of us not to keep coming back. So again, if they're worried about the threat to Israel, which of course they are worried about, Israel is their aircraft carrier, unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Middle East. It's their army base. It's their imperial outpost. They want to preserve the ability of Israel to dominate the whole region, to prevent the national liberation movements coming and taking control of the whole region. I think it's really important to recognize that there's an economic imperative behind all of what we're seeing. The global capitalist economic system is in the depths of its worst ever crisis. It's teetering on the brink of a really catastrophic meltdown. And they're really, truly desperate. The calculus was, when they launched, when they were building up for their war against Russia through Ukraine, that they were going to bring down Russia and get a big looting bonanza, just like the one they got in 1991 when they brought down the Soviet Union. That hasn't happened. The need for such a looting bonanza is getting more and more desperate. The imminence of global financial collapse is getting closer and closer and closer. We're seeing warnings across the financial press about imminent market meltdowns and all kinds of narratives being prepared to try to explain a market meltdown to ordinary people in a way that makes them think that it's not because of the system. It's not capitalism that's failing, it's this or it's that, or it's something caused it, right? Everything was fine, and then one day a thing happened, and then the markets melted down. And they're trying to prepare narratives. I don't know if you saw this, it's a little bit off topic, but one of the narratives they've been preparing is Donald Trump admits the existence of aliens, and then the markets melt down. That was a warning by the Bank of England, right? So this is not like some conspiracy theory. The Bank of England literally put out a warning that the markets should prepare for a meltdown because Donald Trump might be about to say that there are aliens, right? So they're trying to work out how to tell the people how to cover for the failure of global capitalism. So they're desperate. They need this war, even though it's so unpopular, even though none of the peoples of the West want war, even though the peoples of the West are getting poorer, they're not rallying behind their flags. I think your point about the difference between Iraq and Iran is a really interesting one, because I've been thinking about this, right? You know, in the build-up to the Iraq war, the invasion of Iraq in 2003, there was this huge mobilization of the people against it. Up and down the country, there were branches of the anti-war movement that were active and busy. And 2 million people were on the streets of London in February 2003 to say, stop this war. And like this time, we saw this build-up of forces, just as we saw a build-up of forces before the invasion of Iraq. And the people are essentially passive. But it's not that they don't care. And I think this is something quite interesting to understand, because in a way, it's like one step forward, two steps back. We have, in fact, what we're seeing is a massive crisis of legitimacy in the system. Back in 2003, when people marched against the war, they really believed that their leaders would have to listen to them. Now, people don't believe their leaders are going to listen to them. They have no faith in any of the pillars of the establishment or the state. They don't trust the judges. They don't trust the politicians. They don't trust the media. They've had 25 years of having it drilled home to them that these people are lying through their teeth all the time, right? And they've become so used to that and used to feeling powerless that they almost are like, well, what can I do? So that's the downside, is this feeling of powerlessness. The advances, people recognize that the whole system and all its representatives are basically illegitimate. What they haven't learned to do is have faith in themselves and their own power, but a few more knocks to them and they're going to start moving. And there's a huge well of anger, actually, amongst the people for the way the ruling class behaves, for the interests that it prioritizes, for the way that the ordinary people's lives get worse and worse and worse all the time. So in 2003, like you were pointing out, there was a long campaign to manufacture consent and make it look like there were real motivations for the war and that it was legal. And there was all this box ticking done to show, oh no, here's our legal case. And of course, it was shown later. People who were paying attention could see already it was lies, but a lot of people fell for it because they believed in the media and they believed in the politicians. Now they don't. And the politicians have basically given up pretending that that's what they do. But in many ways, that's a big step forward in terms of unmasking the system. When the people start to move, a lot of their illusions have already been shattered. So I think that's really important to recognize, the change in the mood of the people, that on the one hand, they're not mobilizing massively against this war. On the other hand, when the consequences start to hit them, which I think they're going to do before very long economically, there's a huge well of anger in the population, and they despise their politicians and their media and all of the state apparatus.
Let's come a little bit to Europe. Given you rightly said about more than a century of imperial history in the region. I mean, occupation of Egypt, First World War, the illegal war again in Mesopotamia, in other parts of the region, occupation, Sykes-Picot, partition of the region in a very arbitrary manner, suppressing nationalist movement that was growing across the world at the point in time, Balfour Declaration. I mean, you can go on, and that was it's a history that Europeans perhaps perhaps are not very familiar because they don't want to know. But that's where it began. And we are seeing um, similar mindset still there. I mean, the E3 months before what is happening now had invoked the snapback sanctions, which said that, well, Donald Trump went back at the JCPOA, but he was probably right. We want to do the same thing because Iran is not adhering to its commitment. While the reality is completely different. I mean, Iran was pushed to not adhere to some of the commitments by illegal killing and assassinations and threats. And we are now seeing Italy, Spain, France, and others sending reinforcements in Cyprus, where is the Dhekelia and the Akrotiri massive base, the British base. It's a NATO base. It's an outpost of NATO, which is important for West Asia. I mean, a lot of people don't know this, but we did a full show with Matt Cunard about the importance of the Dhekelia and Akrotiri base for West Asia. If you could tell us a little bit about the mood of people in your country about this war, what the ruling elites are doing, and where is Europe in this conflict?
Absolutely. So, you're right that the whole basis, the background, and all of the events that have led up to this war were stem from the actions of imperialism in the region. And the British imperialists were the biggest power in the region. The French had a role, and they, had secret treaties that they made during World War One, how they were going to carve up the Middle East between them after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. We know about those secret treaties because Russia was involved, and the Bolsheviks, at the time of the Russian Revolution, published the secret treaties to let us know. And that was a shock to the people of the region, because at the same time that the British had been agreeing with the French and the Russians how we're going to divide the Middle East up between us three, they had been telling Arab leaders, join with us against the Ottomans and we'll help you get free. So that was obviously a shock. And that, that type of duplicity, the double dealing, the hypocrisy, that is absolutely characteristic of how the imperialists behave, because fundamentally they consider the vast majority of the world's people to not really be people at all, to be beneath them. Their own code of honor doesn't extend to the masses of the world or the oppressed peoples or anyone they're doing deals with, signing agreements with. It's I think it was Sergei Lavrov who coined the term regarding the imperialists that they're agreement incapable. And it was a Victorian British minister, Lord Palmerston. He became prime minister later, but I think he started off as foreign minister, who said, the British, and he just means imperialism, we have no permanent friends, only permanent interests, right? And people should pay attention to that, because that remains the guiding philosophy of imperialism to this day. We have interests, and this is what we focus on. So when we look at the way that the imperialists in Europe and Britain have been behaving in relation to this, we see once again that essentially they continue to act as junior partners to the USA. This is a situation that we've been in really since World War II, when European imperialism was so badly damaged that it was no longer able to be the full-fledged independent imperialist powers they had been before that time, certainly before World War I. And simultaneously, the USA needed actually to resuscitate those falling imperialist powers, because it couldn't be the lone big capitalist power on the planet, right? That wasn't going to work. Remember, socialism was rising. In order to stem the tide of rising socialism, the USA put a lot of effort into reviving empires and imperialist powers that were collapsing. And it did this in its own interests, right? It needed to have a world order of capitalism and capitalist imperialism, it couldn't be the only power, because it would have soon been surrounded, actually, and overwhelmed. But in doing so, it created an order in which it was totally preeminent. And the other imperialist powers started to play kind of adjunct roles to the USA. And with the British, that was particularly the case, because, the British before then had been the dominant global imperialist power. They were, in the 19th century, it was Britain that ruled the world in the way that we now think of, the US empire as being, everywhere, omnipresent in every place. Well, in many ways, the British taught the Americans how to do it. And they continue to be very, very involved in everything that the US is doing. They don't have anymore a big independent armed force. They have a lot of special forces. They have a lot of secret services. They have a lot of psychological operative forces. They are experts in divide and rule, dirty operations, sabotage, psychological warfare, assassinations. In almost all those kind of operations the US is up to, you'll find a few Brits in there as well. And some of them, they're arm's length, they're private companies, but they've all been through the British military establishment. They're all part of that machinery. So this role is consistently played by the British imperialists, and they hide it from their own people. It's really not understood by the British working class or wider population how many countries British imperialism is still involved in, how involved Britain is in so many wars that look like they're America's wars. But you'll find actually there's some British special forces in there too, in Colombia, in Somaliland, in Ukraine, in all kinds of places where the British don't realize their forces are. In fact, in Yemen, of course, we notoriously found out, didn't we, that the war that was presented to us as being a war waged by Saudi Arabia and the UAE turned out to have a control room that was completely run by British and American officers, right? And this we're seeing actually repeated all over the world. And I think it's very important to recognize now, when we see, for example, the British Prime Minister making contradictory statements about how Britain doesn't really want to be, this is not our war, Britain doesn't really want to be involved. Oh, well, if the Americans are involved, well, we have to help them because they're our allies, but we're only there defensively. What does that, if it's an aggressive war, what defensive part is there to play in that aggression, right? It's a total nonsense. The reality is this is theatre for the consumption of the population at home, because war is really unpopular. Because when there's blowback from the war, like, the people are going to blame the government. So the government is trying to present a narrative that says, or the ruling class is trying to present a narrative that says, we're dragged into this, we're just on the fringes, it's not really us, and if Iran hits us, that's totally unjustified. Well, I'm afraid this is nonsense. It's totally justified. Cyprus, as you well said, again, British people don't think about it. Why is there still British sovereign territory in Cyprus, an island in the Eastern Mediterranean? What business have we there? The reason is that when the British were, being forced to let go of most of their colonies, they kept hold of a string of islands that were all, and every one of them, if you look at them, they have a geopolitical significance around the world. As you know, Diego Garcia is one of them in the Indian Ocean. There's the island off of Argentina, Las Malvinas, right? The Falkland Islands. All around the world, there are island bases where the British keep their military stations and bring their naval assets, and the America's naval assets use those, right? So the Air Force and navies, not only of Britain, but of the USA, make use of all of these bases. And the Cypriots, unfortunately, have not been able to fully eject the British bases from their soil, and now they find they're a target. And to be honest, they should have been a target a long time ago, considering all the criminality that is based out of there. They are a very important node in the web of imperialist domination and control of the Middle East. And it's not, in no way can it be seen as something defensive when British and American bombers and spy planes are taking off from there, either to bomb parts of the Middle East or to, as we saw during the Gaza genocide, British RAF planes were overflying Gaza every single day and sending live information to the Zionist target finders, while they were to help them, to facilitate their genocide on a daily basis. So the idea that this is sort of, British people are encouraged to believe that what happens outside of our physical borders is foreign affairs and somehow nothing to do with us. It couldn't be more wrong, because not only are we leaving our ruling class free to conduct the most criminal activities all over the world, looting, plundering, attacking, destroying countries' independence, sovereignty, ability to do anything, plundering their resources and destroying the lives of so many peoples. But this is precisely the source of the strength and power of our ruling class. And it's that strength and power that enables them to crush the working class at home also, to buy off our leaders. Why does the British working class not have one single good militant trade union left to it? Why does it have an anti-war movement that doesn't mobilize against wars? Not even demonstrations, never mind actually stopping the thing, right? The Stop the War coalition hasn't stopped a war, hasn't even got a program for how you stop a war. Right? Because all of the leadership of these mass organizations have been completely bought off by a rich and powerful ruling class. What enables our ruling class to be so rich and powerful? We leave them free to plunder and despoliate the entire world. And that their loot they get from the rest of the world is what gives them the power to crush us at home and buy off our leaders. So the idea that these things are separate is, again, a complete delusion, and something that the European workers are going to have to realize, that they are in the same struggle. Right now, my message to the British and the European working classes is Iranian people are fighting on the front line to weaken your class enemy. And you should not just be supporting them in words and with flags, but in deeds. We should be working to weaken that same enemy on the home front and not allowing the Iranian people to take all the flak for us.
Indeed, and class consciousness at the imperial heartland is very, very important to understand that dynamics. Joti, if we could end by discussing a little bit about the left, if there is anything as such, given the left is divided, if I may say so, on Iran. We did a show with Professor Nina Farnia on the legacy of Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei and the Islamic Revolution, things like redistributive mechanisms within the state, the Bonyats are state contracts, state-owned enterprises in mining, in industries, in military, etc., much of which is geared towards people, much like a socialist state. We have also talked about, and you have spoken about, Iran spearheading the anti-imperial resistance in the region, and we can go on and on. But then there are people who get carried away or misled by the use of religion, the language of religion, etc. And gender issues, a lot of propaganda is there, but of course there are divisions within the gender movement. There's always conflict in every society about how women look at different kinds of freedom. The media, of course, erases that a bulk majority of Iranian women wants to wear the headscarf. They also erase the participation of women in universities and other public spaces, which is perhaps most democratic in the region, etc., etc. But I want you to tell us a little bit more about why a segment of the left, if they are the left, but they do associate themselves with the left, fail to recognize these realities, and why they don't support the Islamic Republic in their fight against the empire.
Thanks, Jyotishman. Well, there's two fundamental reasons why people who call themselves left, progressive, socialist, communist in the imperialist countries, why they fail to understand the essence of the Islamic Revolution and the essence of Iran's stand internationally as well as for its own people. One of them is simply ignorance, a failure to study for themselves, and then a reliance on Western media narratives. And the other one is, of course, that our movement, including much of what calls itself communist and socialist, has leaderships that have been bought off. This is a phenomenon that was called out by Lenin all the way back in World War I. And if you read Lenin's writings, because I live in an imperialist country, it's super important for me to understand these dynamics. And really since the beginning of the special military operation, I've been making a point regularly of looking back at Lenin's writings through the period leading up to and through World War I, because he was working overtime to understand and explain to the masses the rot of social democracy, the chauvinism of the so-called communists and socialists in the imperialist countries. What was the root of that? He showed there was an economic root to that there's a section of the working class and its leadership that gets bought off. Well, that has been absolutely systematized. We have a shameful situation in this country where most of the organizations, apart from my party, that call themselves socialist and communist, including the so-called Communist Party of Britain, they will find some supposedly Iranian organization to hide behind and say, look, this Iranian organization says that everybody hates the regime and that socialists must call for the downfall of the evil fascist Ayatollah. And, the most important thing is the hijab and the freedom of the women. This is basically Western propaganda. The organizations that they refer to, you can actually look at what are those organizations today and see that they basically have become fronts for the CIA. This is life. Organizations which once had a mass base have left Iran and become, appendages to the Western intelligence services. And you have to recognize that that's the role that they now play. So the organizations which hide behind, which will say the Tudeh party says this, and I'm just repeating it. Again, it's like Keir Starmer saying, well, Donald Trump said it, and I just had to say it too. It's a way of hiding your own true nature. The reality is these people all work for British imperialism. They are chauvinist to the core. They do not take it upon themselves to really study and understand the true dynamics. And I hope you'll put up a link to that program you talked about in the show notes for this one, because it sounds like a really useful one for people to watch and understand better. There's very, very little understanding of Iran, its deep and ancient culture and history, but also its modern revolutionary history. Now, I think at this point, when it comes to this question of religion, it really confuses a lot of people. And, they mistake the surface wrapping of something for its true essence. To me, the essence of the Iranian Revolution is an anti-imperialist essence, and it's a popular essence. There's a lot of, as you say, one of the things that happens when you have a big movement against imperialism in an oppressed country, even if you're not setting up a socialist planned economy, you're going to have to do a lot of things for the people, because there's no way you can set up an exploitative regime that oppresses the people and also face down imperialism, right? You're going to have to do something for your people. Russia today is a capitalist country that has to do good things for its people in order to keep them together against imperialism, right? And you see the same with Iran. Now, you saw it with Libya. There's different ways of expressing that popular program. And to be honest, without the pressure of imperialism, it was imperialism that destroyed most of the secular movements of the Middle East. If you go back to the middle of the 20th century, the leadership of all of the anti-imperialist revolutionary movements and national liberation movements of the region was all communist and socialist. What happened? The imperialists drowned that movement in blood. They they massacred so many of them, and they put arms in the hands of local proxies in order to massacre those revolutionaries. So, Iran had an anti-imperialist revolution in 1951. Wasn't led by somebody religious. It's not that Iranians only do religion, right? But what happened across the region when so many secular revolutions and revolutionary movements and leaders were drowned in blood and assassinated, the need for rebellion didn't disappear because the leadership and those organizations had disappeared. If imperialism is still there, looting and suppressing the people, then the need to resist is still there. And what happened was that the resistance moved into the mosques. Now, the imperialists tried to use that. They've taken aspects of, they've tried to weaponize all religions around the world. You'll find a weaponized version that the imperialists have made in order to create their own proxy forces, right? Because religion is something that can be manipulated in all kinds of ways, as we see. But equally, when people need to fight imperialism, if the only thing they've got is the Bible or the Quran, they'll find something in there that tells them, yes, you must resist. You must resist oppression. You must stand up against the oppressors. You must fight back. It's your dignity. And, martyrdom is something to be embraced. Well, this is a philosophy of every national liberation movement. It's not just a religious thing, right? The revolutionary movements of Vietnam and China also had their people who were motivated to martyr themselves for the people, for the wider cause, right? So again, it's very easy to mistake the form for the content. But for me, the essence of all of this is an anti-imperialist revolutionary movement, which has stayed true to that essence. And the reason that the mass of the Iranian people, despite all the hardships they have suffered, because of the hybrid warfare being waged against them, because of the attempts to economically strangle them, the constant warfare being made against them, the sabotage, the psychological operations, all of that, and the media war, the reason that they have stayed true and become even more collected around and supportive of the government in this present period is because they see that it represents their true interests to be sovereign and independent people with dignity, able to use their resources for their own development, able to stand up for themselves against all the bullying and the intimidation and the threats and the warmongering of the Western imperialists.
One of the most fierce phase of resistance to American French imperialism in Vietnam started with a Buddhist monk burning himself up. We'll leave it there, Joti. This was a very illuminating conversation, and thank you so much for your time. I appreciate your answers.
You're welcome. See you again soon.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have 2 requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.